Hi, welcome. My name is Mark Thorsby and this is Ethics. In this video we're going to be taking a look at Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6. So welcome back everyone, I hope you guys are doing well. And I hope you've been following along with our video series. We've gone through this pretty quickly, but you can see I think we've also sort of taken the time to try to dive into some of the more nuanced discussions of Aristotle's. In our last video in Book 5 we looked at the problem of justice, and before that we looked at in book 4, we looked at book 4 and 3, we looked at a number of different virtues. We're going to be continuing today by looking at the virtues of thought. We're going to see that Aristotle offers in this book discussion about two really important elements in philosophy and for ethics, and those include the notion of practical wisdom, but also wisdom in general. So let's sort of jump into it now and sort of go through it. So the first thing here is, we're going to ask ourselves, well, what exactly is the mean regarding the virtues of thought? That is, it's clear that a virtue for Aristotle refers to an excellence, and Aristotle does make a distinction between the intellectual virtues and the moral virtues, but here we're going to sort of address this question of really, I think, of the intellectual virtues, and think about the question of what is the mean with regard to the excellence of thinking and knowledge, ultimately. Aristotle says that in all things there is a mark of reason which guides the dictates of action. So the notion here is that clearly that when a person acts in such a way that they reveal a character trait of excellence, clearly their action is guided by reason to some degree. So in other words, reason provides the standard of action. But we can ask here, well, what exactly is right reason? And secondarily, what standard does reason fix for right action? So what is right reason, and what are the standards here that are associated with right reason? Now Aristotle mentions, of course, here the distinction I just made, which is we can distinguish two types of excellence or virtue. On the one hand, you have virtue of character or moral virtue. On the other hand, you have the virtue of intellect or intellectual virtues. So it's a distinction that we've already talked about. Now here it's important, Aristotle mentions here, to remember that the soul has different parts to it. And remember, actually, if you're interested in Aristotle, he has a great short little book called On the Soul, which is about his notion of the soul. But what we can say here is that there are at least two parts of the soul. There's the rational part and there's the irrational part. Now when we look at the rational part, we can say that there's two parts of the rational part. On the one hand, there's the rational part which is concerned with that which is scientific. Now for Aristotle, who does not live in the contemporary world, and is certainly not thinking about modern physics or modern hard sciences the way we do today in the 21st century, for him, science is concerned with the first principles with first principles in general. Now, in particular, you could say that each science is concerned with the first principles of its subject matter. So, for instance, you can say that physics is concerned with the principles that govern the physical movement of bodies. You could say that psychology is concerned with the principles that govern the psyche or the soul. And you can say that metaphysics is that science which is concerned with the first principles for all of reality. In other words, the first principle of first principles. So on the one hand, the rational part of the soul is concerned with this scientific stuff. But on the other hand, the rational part of the soul works in terms of its ability to calculate things. So Aristotle refers to this as the calculative part of the soul. And here you might say that whereas the scientific is concerned with sort of figuring out and determining the principles that guide all other things, the calculative part is merely that part of our reasoning which we apply in order to calculate means and rationality, right? We try to figure out how to do things, whether it be what's the fastest route to drive to someone's house, or how much money should I give in order to get a good tax break, right? That's a calculative form. So most of the time we probably really in our daily lives use this second form of reasoning the most, the calculative. Okay, so now let's move here and think about the distinction between thought, desire, and decision. Again, I apologize, there's a little spelling error there. Okay, so first off here, I have a couple bullet points. Number one, virtue is relative to its proper function. So that means that an excellence is only excellent with regard to the proper function of its position. Remember, the virtue or the excellence is the mean between an excess and a deficiency or a defect, which means that the virtue is always relative according to the situation and to the context. Now, when we talked about the soul, Aristotle says here we can also distinguish that there are three parts of the soul that seem to relate to action and truth. On the one hand, you have sensation. Now, sensation does not originate action. In other words, sensation is not that which causes us to act. But of course, sensation is an incredibly important part of the soul that relates to action and truth. Number one, in the sense that sensation in our experience helps us understand what's true and what is the case. And secondarily, sensation provides the groundwork knowledge necessary in order for us to act. So sensation is related here, even though it doesn't actually have an origination role. It doesn't originate the action itself or cause the action as such. Second part of the soul is thought. Now, thought here for Aristotle concerns either affirmation or negation. So that's in other philosophies, in Descartes, for instance, he calls this the notion of judgment. But here you can say is that when we think, we either affirm things or in our thoughts or we negate things in our thoughts. So this is another important part. And thought does seem to have the capacity to originate action or to cause action. Now, there also is desire. Now, desire concerns what we pursue, and I shouldn't say pursuit. It either concerns what we pursue or what we flee from, what we avoid. So desire is about pursuit or avoidance ultimately. Okay, and desire also clearly does function in an important way in terms of originating action. Now, these are the three parts of the soul. And remember, for Aristotle, human beings are a rational soul. So a rational soul has these parts to it. Now, practical thinking, that is thinking that relates to action, has to be in alignment with truth and proper desire. So that means that if you're going to think and calculate, ultimately you have to have the right desires and you have the correct sense of what's true. And so all of these converge ultimately to enable this. Now, what exactly does cause action? Aristotle's sort of notion here is that, well, he says that the efficient cause of action is choice. Now, you can take a look at one of my other videos. For Aristotle, there's four types of cause. There's a material cause, an efficient cause, a formal cause, and a final cause. Now, the efficient cause is what we mostly think of cause in the contemporary world. The efficient cause of something refers to the thing or the process by which it was generated, right? So, for instance, I have a daughter, and my wife and I are the efficient cause of my daughter. We caused her to come into being. You can also say that, for instance, gasoline is a part of the efficient causation that enables an automobile to drive forward, or at least a combustion engine automobile. Now, when we think about human action, which is, of course, pardon me, let me take a little drink of water. When we concern ourselves with human action, of course, the efficient cause is choice, right? The ability to choose to act in such a way. Now, what is choice? Well, choice is either derives from a desiring thought, it's a very strange word here, desirative thought, or choice originates from an intellectual choice. So in other words, it looks like our choice either originates from our desires or it originates from an intellectual decision-making process. Now, here we can think of easy examples for ourselves that fit into this. So for instance, when you're taking a class, you may not feel like going to class at 8 in the morning when your class is done, but you still do it. You do it because you've made an intellectual choice. You've thought about it, and you've said, well, if I want to do well in this class, and I want to succeed, and I want to graduate, etc., then I should get up and I should go to class. So that's an intellectual choice, right? Now, it's not that exciting of an intellectual choice, right? Other choices are more interesting. So, for instance, deciding complex financial products, for instance, is also an intellectual choice. But there's other forms of thought which simply arise out of our desires. So, for instance, you can think here about, for some reason this is coming in my head. I'm thinking of, if you've ever seen The Little Mermaid, there's a song that says, go ahead and kiss the girl, right? I think the little crab sings it to the Little Mermaid, right? There the notion is, think about the notion when two people suddenly decide to start kissing, for instance. Well, that is usually not that choice is not the result of an intellectual choice per se, a rational calculation or a rational argument, but it is the result of a thought that comes out of desire. Okay, and you can see what Aristotle is doing here is he's trying to break down and give us a schematic for understanding where choice originates and how rationality fits into the equation of acting and choosing with excellence. Okay, so let's now turn to the notion of scientific knowledge. Now, here we can say that knowledge, when we talk about knowledge, the object of knowledge, scientific knowledge, is necessity, right? So, for instance, think about it. In science, scientists are interested in figuring out what is necessarily the case between different things, not in terms of what could be the case, but what must be the case. So notice here that the scientific laws, think of the law of inertia, for instance, the physical law, the Newtonian physical law. The law of inertia is supposed to express something that's necessary about the movement of physical things in the universe, right? So scientific knowledge is concerned with knowledge that is necessary, right? It's concerned with necessity. Now, necessity ultimately reveals something which is eternal. And that which is eternal for Aristotle is either ungenerated or imperishable, or both, right? So that means that scientific knowledge is seeking knowledge which is the same universally, and it's the same according to nature. So it's not generated, and it'll be true forevermore, right? So think here, this is precisely the case when we think about modern physics and scientific knowledge in that sense, right? It's necessary, it's eternal, or at least it's true throughout time. It's ungenerated, so it's natural, it's not created by us. It's also imperishable, we can't get rid of them. So for instance, the law for the conservation of motion is imperishable. We can't destroy it, and we can't create it, and it's always true, right? So this is the way in which we can think about the domain of scientific knowledge. Now, Aristotle does mention here that there are two forms of reasoning that go into the process of thinking and choosing rational action, right? One form of reasoning is induction. Now, normally, if you're taking my logic class, then I'll tell you that induction is a reasoning procedure that has to do with probability. That's not what Aristotle says here. So I don't think I'm quite in Aristotle's camp here. The light turned off. I hope it's not too dark now. Let me make it like this at least to make sure there's light. But induction for Aristotle, induction begins with the first principles, and the notion that Aristotle has here is you begin with the first principles, and then from the first principles you begin to extrapolate how you begin to extrapolate and infer things from those first principles. Whereas deduction begins from universals and then articulates necessary particular relations. What I want you to think about, just to keep things straight and to keep things nice and easy, is that induction refers to reasoning by probability, whereas deduction refers to reasoning by necessity. Now, this isn't quite Aristotle's way of thinking about it, but it is the more contemporary and I think the better way to think about this. So you have these two different forms of reasoning. So what does that mean knowledge is? Well, Aristotle tells us at 1139b31, sorry, that's the longest page number ever, right? He says that knowledge, quote, is a state of capacity to demonstrate. So in other words, his notion is that when you have knowledge, you have the ability to demonstrate why something is the case or how something is the case. So in other words, knowledge is a state of being in which you have the capacity to demonstrate something. Now you can see that's a very wide and universal definition there, but I think it's actually quite brilliant because I think it solves some of the problems that you see, for instance, in Plato's Theaetetus. But anyway, I'm off track. Okay, so we've talked about scientific knowledge, but there's other types of knowledge, right? You also can have craft or artistic knowledge, right? And here we have to make the distinction. We talked about necessity with regard to scientific knowledge. Well, what is necessity opposed to? Well, necessity is opposed to, whoa, I did it the wrong way. Let me see here, sorry about that. Necessity is opposed to contingency, right? Contingency refers to the idea that something doesn't necessarily have to be the way it is. Now, what Aristotle says, to make it easy for us, is that things that are contingent are either things that are made, they're created, or there are things that are done. There are things that are enacted by people. But neither things which are made nor things which are done are necessary, because we can always imagine that they didn't have to happen, right? So, so that's the first thing. Now, we can say is that things that are made and things that are done each have different reason capacities. So there's different ways of reasoning about how to make something versus how to act in a certain sort of way, or when you have to do something and you reason about it. So we can make this distinction between the capacities, right? Now, art concerns the capacity to make. So you can see here what Aristotle is doing is that when we talk about the sort of knowledge that the person has in terms of art, we can say that it involves a form of reasoning that's concerned with contingency in particular. And it does involve a true course of reasoning. So just because the knowledge of the artist, and here I should mention that for Aristotle, the knowledge of the artist is not just, we think of the aesthetic artist, the person who paints or something like this, or a sculptor or something. But for Aristotle, the artist is anyone who makes anything, right? So the carpenter is an artist. It's the art of carpentry, right? There's the art of brewing beer, for instance. That's a capacity to make something. So whenever you think about making something, there's an art involved, right? For instance, for Aristotle, he would say that, when the writer is also an artist because they make books, but so too is the fence builder. The fence builder is an artisan, right? So think of artisan rather than artist when you think of Aristotle. Now, but just because the artist makes something and it's contingent, right, doesn't mean that there's not a true course of reasoning involved. It is just a different sort of sphere of reasoning. And you can see here is that it's important that we are able to do these things, because if ethics is ultimately concerned with how we act and the things that we do and the things that we make, then you can see here that craft knowledge, or art, the knowledge of the artisan, is very important. All this is leading up to Aristotle's conception of phronesis. Now, in this section, they label it prudence, but I want you to think of the term phronesis. Some translations will just say practical wisdom. Okay, but let's start with this. What is practical wisdom and who has it? Now, Aristotle's first general answer is, well, the person who has practical wisdom is the person who can deliberate about what is good. Now, that's a very general statement, but think about this. Imagine that, for instance, you are, let's say you're rebuilding your house and you hire a carpenter. And you ask your carpenter, can I put this wall here? Can we take that wall out there? I'd like a sink here, etc., etc. Well, the person who has the practical wisdom is the person who can deliberate, and they can think through about what is best or what is good in that particular situation. So you can see here is that prudence is not knowledge per se, right? Because it's an ability to deliberate, right? To do something with knowledge. You can say that prudence or practical wisdom requires knowledge, at least some type of knowledge, but it's not identical with knowledge. Nor is practical wisdom identical with art or the contingency of making things, right? Ultimately, we'll see that practical wisdom concerns the contingency of things that are done, right, in the last example. Now, an example of this is Pericles, and I misspelled Pericles. It says Pericles, so my apologies to Pericles out there. But Pericles is sort of an example. Pericles is a great example because, remember, if you go back in your history, Pericles was the great statesman of ancient Athens who lived roughly around the time of Socrates, or a little bit earlier than at the same time as Socrates, but he was older than Socrates. But Pericles was the great statesman who helped lead Athens into its greatest period, known as the Golden Age. Unfortunately, Pericles was also the person who led them into the sort of demise of ancient Athens as well. But we won't get into that. But Pericles he wasn't an artisan, and he wasn't a scientist per se, but he had the wisdom about how to lead the state. That is, he was able to deliberate about what was good in the highest sense, what was good for all people in the state of Athens. So Pericles is this great example of someone who has practical wisdom. You can also think of in your own life about someone who has great wisdom, practical wisdom. Think about someone who knows how to deliberate and how to do what is good in specific practical context, right? So usually the person who has practical wisdom doesn't have practical wisdom or phronesis about everything, but rather about certain things, about specific things, right? Um, and the way Aristotle starts to break this down is he says that the prudent person knows, number one, what's good for themselves, but they also know what's good for men in general, right? Um, and I think you can also say is that they also know what's good with regard to their field, right? So that means that the prudent person is able to sort of recognize and deliberate about a whole range of things that are good. Now, Aristotle does say specifically that there is no excellence in practical wisdom. That is, there is no virtue in practical wisdom. For practical wisdom is the virtue. It is the excellence. So that's sort of interesting thing. It's not so much that you have practical wisdom combined with virtue. It's rather that practical wisdom is itself a form of virtue or excellence that we should attain or seek after. Okay. Now the next sort of section is on understanding, and what I want to do here is I want to read to you the passage. So let me just take a brief aside here. Let me just pause the video for a second and pull that up. Okay, great. So welcome back. I pulled this up. Let me go ahead and read you this section. And again, this comes from Aristotle's book 6, section 6, right? Aristotle says, quote, "Scientific knowledge is judgment about things that are universal and necessary, and the conclusions of demonstration. And all scientific knowledge follow from the first principles, for scientific knowledge involves apprehension of a rational ground. This being so, the first principle from which what is scientifically known follows cannot be an object of scientific knowledge of art or practical wisdom, for that which can be scientifically known can be demonstrated. And art and practical wisdom deal with things that are variable or contingent. Nor are these first principles the objects of philosophical wisdom, for it is the mark of the philosopher to have demonstration about some things. If then the states of mind by which we have truth, and are never deceived about things invariable or even variable are scientific knowledge, practical wisdom, philosophical wisdom, and intuitive reason, and it cannot be any of the three, that is, i.e. practical wisdom, scientific knowledge, or philosophical wisdom. The remaining alternative is that it is intuitive reason that grasp the first principles." Now, ultimately there what Aristotle is arguing is that the sort of understanding which grasp the first principles is a comprehension. Now, I think that the text out, one of the translations I was looking at used the word comprehension. But it's important here to recognize that Aristotle thinks that he takes sort of a moment here to articulate the primary basis upon which all of these wisdoms rest, and that is his notion of understanding. But the key here is the understanding grasp of first principle. Now, we haven't really talked about it in this video, but a first principle cannot itself be demonstrated, at least within its own subject matter, because the subject matter itself depends for its comprehensibility on the first principle. So in other words, first principles themselves sort of come first, and Aristotle thinks it's important to mark out here that the first principles are intuited out of comprehension. They're not specifically related to philosophical wisdom, which is about things that are necessary, or about practical wisdom, which concerns things that are contingent. Okay, so this means now that we've sort of talked about that, we can now finally start to distinguish the difference between wisdom and prudence, or wisdom and phronesis and practical wisdom. The first thing that Aristotle recognizes is that, well, wisdom can come in two different forms. On the one hand, you can have specific particular wisdom, that is wisdom about particular things, and you can also have wisdom in general. Of course, wisdom in general is the one that is the highest, because everyone wants that, right? Because if you have wisdom in general, then you'll also have specific wisdom, or so you might say, right? So you can see here that what is wisdom, though? Well, one way of describing it is to say that wisdom is, quote, the most finished of the forms of knowledge, end quote. And that comes from 1141b17 in Aristotle's corpus. That's the Becker number, by the way. Wisdom is the most finished of the forms of knowledge. That is, wisdom is the completion of knowledge. So that means that wisdom is the combination of comprehension or understanding and knowledge, right? It's through comprehension and understanding that we gain the first principles, and then knowledge in specific ways. And we already talked about what he said knowledge was. And so knowledge is a combination of these two things. Now, what this means is that practical wisdom is not the highest form of knowledge, right? Because it's only about contingent things. The highest form of knowledge, would be knowledge which is about necessary universal things. So you can see here is that ultimately, even though practical wisdom or phronesis plays a totally incredible role within Aristotle's ethics, he ultimately thinks that practical wisdom is secondary to wisdom in general. Now, what this means is that wisdom is not about the art of politics. And remember, going all the way back from our first video here on book 1, we was actually books 1 through 3 in that video, we said that we saw that Aristotle argues that politics is the highest science. But you can see here is that wisdom isn't the same thing as politics, right? Wisdom is not the art of politics. It's not about how to make things politically, right? He says, and the reason is because wisdom is about first principles of all things, at least the highest form of wisdom. But you can see here is politics is about human beings. But man, or human beings, are not the best things in the universe, and so therefore wisdom is not about politics per se. It's about the best things, not whereas man cannot be that, because man is not the best thing, right? I mean, here he would say, for instance, that things like mathematical principles are universal or higher than politics because of their universality. And one of the examples he gives here is Thales. Thales was wise, but didn't always exhibit practical wisdom. There's this famous story of Thales who was looking up at the stars, and as he was walking, he accidentally fell into a well because he wasn't watching where he was going. So that's an example of someone who doesn't seem to have a lot of practical wisdom, but he was wise and very famous. And he was wise particularly in the sense that Thales was trying to articulate the first principles of the heavens, right? So by contrast, what we can say is that phronesis is concerned with things that are human, right? So phronesis is the wisdom that relates to the political sciences. And phronesis is concerned with things that are subject to deliberation. Because remember, phronesis is concerned with what we can act and what we can make. And so those are subject to deliberation. And this, of course, includes self-interest. We can make a distinction between the phronesis of particulars and the phronesis of universals. But ultimately, I think what we'll see here is that for Aristotle, there are many forms of phronesis. So because there's many forms of phronesis, there has to be one sort of ruling kind of phronesis, one general form of phronesis. And so what Aristotle wants to then do here in this passage is then go through and maybe lay out the different types of phronesis, the different types of practical wisdom, and then ultimately articulate which one of these is going to have the highest form. Let's see, I'm going to take a moment break here because I think someone's coming to my office here in just a second. Let me take a break here. Give me just 1 second. I'll be right back. All right, sorry about that. So anyway, so there we have to begin to sort of articulate, well, what are the different types of practical wisdom or prudence? Well, okay, first, we've already noted one, and this is the difference between political wisdom versus practical wisdom. Now, political wisdom is the wisdom that is concerned with ultimately the knowledge of how, and let's put it, the deliberation and understanding combined with the knowledge of how best to organize the affairs of people in a political context or in a social context. Practical wisdom is very similar, but its object seems to be different here. So what Aristotle notices that political wisdom and practical wisdom have a similar state of mind, but they're not identical in themselves, okay? So what are the different types that we can mention? Well, Aristotle mentions practical wisdom, which we've talked about, which is ultimately concerned with how the individual deliberates and understands and acts. But there's other forms, right? For instance, there's in household management. He says that in household management, you have to create rules, right? So household management is a state of mind that's concerned with legislation, setting up the best way to organize the affairs of the household, right? Or the affairs of the civil society or something like this. And then, of course, there's political wisdom, which is concerned with the laws and the way in which laws should be developed. But he also even makes the distinction, there's deliberative wisdom, the wisdom of how one should deliberate. And here he's thinking about the courts and what judges do. And there's also judicial wisdom, right? The wisdom of how one should apply the law. So you can see here there's a variety of forms of practical wisdom. But in all of them, what we see is that phronesis requires experience. That is, you can't have practical wisdom unless you're already familiar with those things that you have to deliberate about. Now, this means that for Aristotle, he thinks that this is why most young people do not have a practical wisdom. Not because they're foolish, but mainly because they're inexperienced. And it's because of that inexperience, or the lack of experience there, that the young person is more liable to, not act in the most practical or the wise manner. So remember, when we talk about wisdom, we often think, we have an image where we think about the person who's older and who's lived a long time. And that in a certain way is wrong, because person who's old is not necessarily wise. I can think of many different people who are old, who have lots of experience, but who are fools and don't actually know how to act in the right way. On the other hand, I can think of many young people who do have more wisdom than other people. So wisdom is not necessarily something that has to do with age. But for Aristotle, there is a clear link, and it has to do with phronesis, right? Because to deliberate and to act best in a practical sense requires that you have some experience in the world. So given this, there is a sense in which we should recognize that the person who's older than us, or the person who's had more experiences than us, may be better equipped to ultimately deliberate and to engage in the reasoning process of practical wisdom. So one thing next here is we have to talk about good deliberation. What is good deliberation? Well, here we can make the distinction between inquiry versus deliberation, right? To inquire about something is to seek after it and to learn about it. To deliberate is to determine how you ought to act, right? Is to think through your reasoning with action as a sort of goal or end state. So what are some of the things that Aristotle recommends? One is that we should always deliberate slowly, right? And this we should all sort of know. Whenever we act hastily or think through something quickly, we are much more inclined to make a mistake. So Aristotle sort of recognizes this, and I sort of enjoyed that he says this, because Aristotle's so brilliant, he's such a genius, that you imagine that he's just deliberate really quickly. But even he himself says, no, you have to take your time when you deliberate on things. Remember, deliberation concerns action, right? Now, the excellence of deliberation is, quote, a certain correctness of deliberation which tends to attain the good. And that comes from 1142b16. So here you can see is that the excellence of deliberation is a certain correctness of deliberation. Now that doesn't help here, because what is correct? Well, you can see that the correctness of deliberation is something which is always relative to the action that one takes and the good that one is trying to attain. So Aristotle is speaking in highly generalized terms here, which makes it sort of difficult. I don't have time to go through it because I want to keep this video sort of short and snappy today. But take a look at the passage on 114b33. Actually, so that should be 11. Oh, I'm missing something. I think it's 1142b33. So I think I actually mistyped it. But take a look at that passage where he talks about this distinction between deliberation. There's a really good passage there. Now, next here is comprehension. Back to comprehension, or comprehension. And here, we want to say that the comprehension is not the same thing as having an opinion, and comprehension is not the same thing as having understanding. Now, there's a little bit of a difficulty here, because in one translation of Aristotle, they use the term comprehension for understanding, and in another translation, they don't use that term. So there's a little bit of things. So what we're talking about here is that form of reasoning procedure in which you gain insight, but it's not the same thing as opinion, and it's not understanding. So it's not, well, let's go through this. Understanding concerns the subjects of the questioning and the deliberated. So understanding is trying to figure out what you have to question and deliberate. That is, understanding in a certain way fixes the terms of deliberation. Now, understanding has the same objects of phronesis. So understanding is concerned with the same things that phronesis is concerned with. But understanding judges while phronesis commands understanding. So we can say here is that understanding ultimately is a type of judgment we make about things, but it doesn't ultimately inform our action per se, right? So let's keep moving here. Number 11, practical thought and particulars. So first of here, as we can say, is that judgment is the right discrimination of the equitable, or at least that's what Aristotle says. So what is judgment? Judgment is about figuring out what is equitable, particularly in the affairs of moral discourse. And think here about the way that a judge discriminates, what is equitable. And we saw that in the last video when we looked at, I think that was book 5, and we talked about that. But one of the things we see is that when we talk about practical thought and all of the particulars that we have to judge when we're going through life, we have to figure things out. All of these states of excellence and virtue and all of these particulars, they ultimately have to converge in some way. At least they converge in the lives we live and ultimately the choices we make. These states of excellence are all natural endowments. These virtues are, because their convergence is required for the natural end of human action, which of course we've mentioned is happiness. So that means that we should attend to, quote, the undemonstrated, let me put it this way, let me finish this up. So all of these virtues ultimately converge, and practical wisdom helps enable us and I would say modify and guide that convergence. Now, one of the things, though, that Aristotle says at the end here is that we should, in fact, attend to the undemonstrated sayings and opinions of the experience and of older people because they have the eye to see. In other words, sometimes part of the problem is because of our inexperience, we lack the requisite knowledge to recognize how things should converge and what matters and what doesn't. And so that means that sometimes we have these older people, or we hear these sayings of people who've lived before us, who have more life experience. And they tell us that they give us words of wisdom, but they don't demonstrate why they're true or not. They don't give us arguments, they just give us the saying. And Aristotle is recommending here that we actually make sure to listen to what those sayings are, because since those people have lived through the life, they have an ability to recognize things that we don't. And this has to do with the convergence of practical wisdom and all this stuff. Finally here, I think I got 2 more sections here. Aristotle does discuss some of the puzzles that relate to prudence and wisdom. For instance, we can ask, well, what is the utility? What's the use of all these mental qualities and capacities? Well, number 1, Aristotle says wisdom is not that which makes people happy, right? So wisdom doesn't make you happy. Remember, wisdom is about having knowledge of these first causes and first principles, and there's complete wisdom and specific wisdom and so forth. But simply being wise doesn't make you happy. Remember, for Aristotle, in his Ethics, happiness is, he used the term eudaimonia, which means to flourish, right? So just because you're wise, that is just because you have this complete knowledge, doesn't actually make you happy. So you can see here is that wisdom isn't enough, you need prudence. And wisdom is, what is wisdom interested in? It's interested in the being of things. For instance, wisdom is interested in what is always true under all conditions. It's interested in these universal things that are necessarily true. Whereas he thinks that prudence is concerned with the things that are happening in a contingent, non-necessary manner. So wisdom is interested in being, right, in a sort of kind of, I guess, philosophical or deep sense here. Now, for those who are already good, phronesis is of no use, right? So the person who is already good, they don't have to figure out how to become good. So that means that phronesis, or practical wisdom, is for those of us who have not yet attained the good life, but are seeking after it. So wisdom, so you can see here is that you need wisdom, but wisdom doesn't seem to be enough. You need phronesis, but on the other hand, phronesis is only for those people who are good. So you can see here, these are puzzles, right? So one of the quotes that I liked here, I just sort of pulled this stuff out, is Aristotle says, quote, the function of man is achieved only in accordance with phronesis. Remember, the function of man, or the telos of man, is happiness. So happiness can only be achieved with practical wisdom. Wisdom by itself is not enough. Now, virtue brings us to the right choice, right? So excellence brings us to the right choice, but its actualization, that is, to actually make the right choice, requires another faculty. And in the translation that I've been using, he calls this cleverness. That is, cleverness is the ability to sort of, it goes back to that calculative part of the soul that he was talking about earlier. So phronesis requires cleverness. But the problem is that cleverness in itself can either be either good or it can be villainy, right? You can be clever and evil, right? Or you can be clever and good. But his notion is that phronesis, as a practical wisdom, always aims towards that good. So that sort of gives you a sense here. And think here, the Nazis were very intelligent, right? They're also the Nazis were extremely good at planning wars, and unfortunately, very good at planning genocide, right? So they had a cleverness, but under Aristotle's corpus here, organon, we would say that the Nazis lacked practical wisdom ultimately because they were unable to choose happiness because they weren't good, right? So, quote, it is impossible to be practically wise without being good. So you can see that phronesis and goodness are completely tied up together. Now let's talk about practical wisdom and the virtue of character. Now Aristotle does make a distinction between what we might call a natural virtue versus virtue in the strict sense. Okay, virtues imply practical wisdom, but are not necessarily identical with it. So Aristotle actually offers a critique of Socrates here, where he thinks that Socrates was right about some things, but wrong about other things. I'm not going into it. He thinks that ultimately that Socrates confuses the distinction between virtue in the strict sense and natural virtue. Excellence or virtue requires the presence of right reason. So you can't have excellence without thinking rationally, which is or having some sort of dictate of reasoning. So phronesis is not supreme over wisdom, but you can say is that phronesis is necessary for happiness. Perhaps a certain degree of wisdom is also necessary for happiness, but phronesis is at the very core of it. So what we can see here is that that sort of concludes my quick, and I apologize if I went real quick this time, but this sort of concludes our discussion of Aristotle's discussion of phronesis. So what we've seen here is that happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. We've seen that the virtue or is an excellence, and it's always a mean between an excess or a defect in some way. And then we've looked at a number of different virtues in particular. Most importantly, we've looked at justice in Book 5. And in this book, we've looked at the role of phronesis, or practical reasoning. Because you can see here is that simply having the virtues of character, right? Simply having courage, simply having temperance, simply having these things, which by the way is no simple matter to attain, but even if you have all these moral virtues, unless you have the ability to reason and to think in the proper way, you're never going to be happy, right? So just because I'm like think about it this way. Here's the example I give, is think about the soldier who has courage. Well, the soldier who has courage, that's part of what they need. But ultimately, in order to flourish and to be happy and to succeed, the soldier also needs to know how to think and to reason properly about battle strategy, right? About guarding your flanks or whatever it is, right? So phronesis is the nether ingredient here. And you can see what Aristotle has been doing with all of these books is he's really providing us a discussion of the variety of necessary conditions for happiness, but none of them are sufficient in themselves. So simply having phronesis is not sufficient. You have to also have justice and these other virtues. But having the virtues are not simply sufficient either. So ultimately what he's trying to articulate is a list of the necessary conditions, and hopefully we'll gain some knowledge of what the sufficient conditions are to live a happy life. Thank you guys very much for watching online. I look forward to seeing you guys in our next video, which will be on Book 7 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Okay? I'll see you guys online.